So we're on part 2 of our series on church history, which means we're up to this enormous period from 300 to 1400 AD. I'm going to wrap up around about 1,000 years of history in the next 4 lessons. So let's get straight into it. Lesson 6 is the one we're up to today, looking at the marriage of church and empire, of church and state. Let's just do a very quick recap of kind of what we've got to so far and where we're at in church history. So looking at a timeline of 0 AD to around 400. We've got the life of Jesus there. Obviously the calendar is based around Jesus' birth and life, so it's fairly easy to remember when Jesus lived. Just start at the year 0 and you're right. After Jesus, of course, we have the church beginning, and we see what we see in the New Testament. The gospel spreads and congregations are formed. We then have what we've been looking at for the last few weeks is the early Christian writers. So now you may not be able to remember what they all stood for and who they were, but the names might be familiar to you. Irenaeus and Polycarp and Clement and Tertullian and Origen. Some of these names are maybe familiar to you, I hope. So they fit into this era here. We've been looking at people who come a couple of generations after the New Testament and some of the good and some of the bad things that were happening in the church there. What we haven't been looking at is what's been happening in the world at this stage. So I want us to just look at outside of the church, what was going on in the world in the first couple of 100 years after the church began. And the answer in one word is instability. The world was a very unstable place. The Roman Empire was in control. It's somewhat similar to the United States today. The United States is the real dominant nation that has an influence on the rest of the world. It's kind of ironic that the United States began with the Boston Tea Party when they said, well, we demand representation. We demand that we get a voice in government in order to be influenced by the rules and laws that you made. It's quite ironic now that we get influenced by the laws that are made in the US and we don't get to have a say. So we could lay the same accusation against them. But the United States is a good example of the influence that Rome had. Rome was the dominant empire, and what Rome did was important for most people around the world. So in the early 200s, you have instability, and that is exacerbated by, believe it or not, pandemics. Now, we have a little bit of experience in pandemics, so we can relate to this a touch. So in these years, pandemics were quite common, and there was a pandemic that came through the Roman Empire in about the year 250. It was probably a form of Ebola, so things really don't change, do they? It devastated the Roman Empire. At its peak, it's killing around about 5,000 people a day. One non-Christian historian said when it went through a town, this disease was wiping out up to 30% of the people in an average town that it went through. There's a writer, a Christian writer at the time, who described what it was like to live through the plague in those times. He said this: "There broke out a dreadful plague, and excessive destruction of a hateful disease invaded every house in succession of the trembling populace, carrying off day by day with abrupt attack numberless people, everyone from his own house. All were shuddering, fleeing, shunning the contagion. There lay over the whole city no longer bodies, but the carcasses of many." So this is obviously different from our experience in Australia with the pandemic coming through. This is drastic. This is an awful situation where people are dropping dead left, right and centre, and the bodies are piling up in the streets. So along came a Christian writer at the time, and his name is Cyprian. He comes from Carthage in northern Africa there in the 200s, and so he experienced this plague, and he wrote about what Christians should do in a pandemic and what Christians should do when there's a disease that's ravaging through. And his words are really meaningful for our current situation that we're in and just show the Christian response that should be there. So I just want to share with you some things that he had to say about how Christians should handle pandemics. He said, "How suitable, how necessary it is this plague and pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly. It searches out the justice of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race, whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love their kinsmen as they should, whether masters show compassion to their ailing slaves, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted, begging their help. He's saying here, a plague and a pandemic, it exposes your condition. It exposes who you are. It exposes whether you're the kind of person that is in it for you or in it to give and to be selfless. He goes on and he says, it exposes whether the violent repress their violence, whether the greedy, even through the fear of death, quench the ever insatiable fire of their raging avarice, whether the proud bend their necks, whether the shameless soften their pride, whether the rich, even when their dear ones are perishing and they're about to die without heirs, bestow and give something. And I think that's true of the church today, isn't it, in the pandemic? COVID-19 doesn't really impact our faith as much as it exposes the faith that we have. And people who have lost their faith because of the virus, it wasn't really because of the virus that they lost their faith. It was because they had an unstable and shallow faith to begin with. And the virus and the pandemic has simply exposed the weaknesses that were there. I think we see the same thing today. But Christians who have a solid foundation and a solid faith, they do not shy away when disaster comes. They do not hide when hard days come. And so another Christian at this time called Dionysius, he wrote about the proper Christian response to a pandemic. Dionysius said this: "Most of our brethren showed love and loyalty in not sparing themselves while helping one another, tending to the sick with no thought of danger, and gladly departing this life with them after becoming infected with their disease." That is such a moving line there. Gladly departing this life with the people who had died after becoming infected with their disease. Many who nursed others to health died themselves. The best of our own brothers lost their lives in this way. Some presbyters, some deacons, and laymen. A form of death based on strong faith and devotion that seems in every way to equal martyrdom. And then he reports on what the non-Christians did. He said, this is the Christian response. But you know what happens to someone who doesn't have a faith in Christ in times of crisis? He reports on how the pagan non-Christian Romans responded. He said, the heathen non-Christians do the exact opposite. They pushed away those with the first signs of the disease and fled from their dearest. They even threw them half dead onto the roads and treated unburied corpses like refuse in hopes of avoiding the plague of death, which for all of their efforts was difficult to escape. Times of crisis reveal whether you're in this for yourself or whether you're truly living selflessly for others. And this pandemic was a great way to show the world what Christians were about. Christians are always going to live selflessly, going to give their life for others because of our deep and unshakable love. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, Cyprian quotes from this verse when he's teaching Christians how to behave in a pandemic. 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, he says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others who have no hope." Cyprian quotes this verse. It says, in a pandemic, we have hope. We know that things only get better after this life. We know that we have a resurrection awaiting us. We know that life beyond is far better than the life we leave behind. So we will sacrifice. Even if it costs my life, even if it costs my health and safety, I will devote myself to serving and loving and caring for others. He also went to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 was another verse that he used to encourage his brethren. 1 John 2 and verses 15 through 17 on being spiritually minded. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. So Cyprian encouraged them. Serve, love, care. And they did. Christians went out and did it, and they left a precedent for us to follow. When disaster comes, we do not look out for ourselves first. We care for the weak and the vulnerable, the people who need help. 1,000 years later in Germany, in a town called Wittenberg, there's a man by the name of Martin Luther. You might have heard of him. And a plague comes to his town. And he knows what they did back in the early church. And he recognises that, and he says, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're not going to run. We're not going to flee. We're going to stay, and we're going to take care of people who are vulnerable. And he stayed, and he helped. And he lost his own daughter in the process. His daughter died because he was devoted to caring for people. That's the ultimate sacrifice, isn't it? Losing a child for the salvation of others. That's something that God knows all about. Martin Luther says this: those who are engaged in spiritual ministry, such as preachers and elders, must likewise remain steadfast before the peril of death. We have a plain command from Christ. In John 10 and verse 11, a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, but the hireling sees the wolf coming and flees. For when people are dying, they most need a spiritual ministry which strengthens and comforts their consciences. And this is a warning and an encouragement to leaders today and shepherds in the church today. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And so leaders in the church take this seriously. Take this seriously when John records these words of Jesus. That good shepherding is about pure selflessness for the good of the flock, sacrificing whatever it takes for the good of the congregation and to save the lost sheep. Very inspiring, very inspiring. So we have the early Christian writers, and we have this plague, we have this instability. And you would think that this would help Christians. You would think that people would see the great benefit that they are for society, and they'd say, great, let's stop persecuting these Christians and let's let them practice their religion. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. When you have plagues, you have instability. You have financial instability. You have social insecurity. In the 3rd century, Rome had plague after plague. It had enemies threatening from the east and the north and the south. The Roman Empire was in shambles, so much so that the historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. This was all over the place. And so they decide that the reason why Rome is falling apart is probably because of Christianity. It's probably because the Roman gods are so upset at us because people are turning to Jesus. And so they attack Christians all the more heavily, and they persecute Christians to an unparalleled level before. Cyprian, who we read of before, lovely, good Christian writer, he dies in a brutal execution. We actually have the record of his execution. It happened on the 14th of September, 258. And he was called to stand trial in front of a man by the name of Galerius. And Galerius is a Roman official. And this is the transcript of what happened. Galerius says, "Are you Cyprian?" Cyprian says, "I am." Galerius says, "The most sacred emperors have commanded you to conform to the Roman religious rituals." And Cyprian says, "I refuse." Galerius says, be careful, or take heed, or look after yourself here. You know what's at stake. And Cyprian says, do as you have been ordered. There's no need for deliberation. You know what you're going to do, and I know what I'm going to do. There's no negotiation here. I'm here to die for my faith. Galerius says, since you have set yourself as an enemy of the gods of Rome and of our religious practices, the emperors could not be able to bring you back to the observance of their sacred laws. And also, you're an instigator and leader of most atrocious crime. That's just practicing Christianity. Tharsius Cyprian is sentenced to die by the sword. And Cyprian's final words, and may it be our final words, thanks be to God. And then they kill him. They chop off his head, as is seen in this photo here, which is quite an odd photo, but picture painting. They kill Cyprian, and they kill, and they kill, and they kill. But in all of their killing, they can't wipe out Christians. The attacks get worse and worse and worse. Until one night in 313 AD, where a man has a dream and he changes history forever because of his dream. It happens on this river here and this particular bridge. This is just near Rome, and at the time in 313 AD or so, there was no official emperor of Rome. There were a couple of people kind of fighting it out for it. So there was one man by the name of Maxentius, and Maxentius had a big army, and he thought that he could probably be the emperor of Rome. There was another man called Constantine who had a small army, about half the size, and he wanted to be emperor of Rome. And so Maxentius took his troops out to this river, crossed over, and met Constantine and said, you're not coming into Rome, because if you come in, you're going to be emperor and you're going to kick me out. And so they all prepare for war, and then they go to sleep, because you have to get your sleep before you go to war. And as they're sleeping the night before the battle, Constantine has a dream. And in this dream, and there are some conflicting accounts, but this is roughly what he says about the dream. He says that he saw a symbol, and this is the symbol that he saw. It doesn't mean a whole lot to you and I, but he says he saw this symbol, and he was told, a voice said, in this symbol, through this sign, you will win your victory. And, well, Constantine doesn't really know what it means. He doesn't really understand, but he's got an army half the size of the other guy, and he wants to do anything he can to win the battle at that stage. So he says, I'll take it, and I'll put it on all my shields in the army that I have. And so he goes out and he fights the battle with this symbol on it, and he wins. Just because of the way that the armies were laid out, he manages to push the other army into the river, and they all fall in, and most of them lose their life in that way. We don't know when Constantine actually figures out what this symbol means, but it was actually a symbol for Christianity in those days. It's made up of two letters. The X there is the Greek letter chi, and the long line with the kind of P at the top, that's the Greek letter rho. And so put them together and you get this symbol, and that's the start of the name Christ. So Christians would make this little symbol to represent Christianity. Well, Constantine, he's happy. He's emperor. He won this battle and he loves this symbol. And so he says, yeah, I love Christians. You know, they're my new favourite people. No more persecuting Christians, because apparently the God of Christianity likes me. It also helped that his mum was a Christian. So he was a bit of a mama's boy, it seems, and just did what his mum wanted. I wouldn't say that to his face. He would chop me in half. But so Augustine did Christians a few favours because he liked this God. He thought, this God likes me, helped me win my battle. And so he made Sundays a public holiday. The reason you and I have Sundays off is because of Constantine, because he wanted to do a favour because he had a dream one night. Isn't that funny? I just find that amazing how a guy having a dream 1,700 years ago is the reason why Sunday is a day off in our culture today. History is just such a strange thing. He also gave Christians a lot of money for building church buildings all over the place. So everything worked out well, and Rome and Christianity met together. And what could possibly go wrong by mixing politics and religion together? That's just destined for success, isn't it? We only see success there. No, of course. This was the start of things going terribly wrong. And we see from this point onwards that there are many, many problems that come from this marriage of the empire and the church. Before we get to the negatives, let me just say that there were some great positives that did come out of it. First of all, the empire started to take on Christian morals. So the Romans decided, actually, adultery and rape, they're not good things, and they should be forbidden and actually punished. The idea that women shouldn't be sexually assaulted and shouldn't just be the property of powerful men was a radical change in Roman culture, one that we see still the effects of today. The whole Me Too movement, the whole idea that women shouldn't just be sexually abused by powerful men, this all stems from Christianity being incorporated into the Roman Empire. Things like abortion and infanticide in the Roman world, it was quite common to leave your kids out to starve, to abandon your children when they were young if they were unwanted. That became forbidden. The gladiator games were stopped because Christians didn't want people killed like that. Churches began starting hospitals and schools, and there were rules that were put in place to treat slaves better. There were rules that were put in place to make prisons a little bit more humane instead of being torture chambers. But unfortunately, with all of those positives came some negatives. And this is what we're going to look at in the next couple of lessons. What happens when you mix the empire with the church? I'll just go over a couple of things to begin with. Christians, some of the negatives. As Christians were tolerated, other religions were severely persecuted. And now, of course, we do believe that Christianity is the one way to Christ, the one way to eternal life. But these other religions were persecuted in a terrible way, especially the Jews and other beliefs at that time. They were really persecuted in an awful way that led to a lot of the anti-Jewish movements of later history, resulting in things like the Holocaust and such. All of that anti-Jewish sentiment really finds its origin when the church and the empire meet. Secondly, another bad thing that happened was the emperor and the government started having a say in church issues, because it was in their best interests for the church to be unified and to teach one thing. So the emperor and the empire decided that they would help the church in finalising its doctrine and making sure it knew what it believed. One of the other main things that happened, the third main disadvantage, was that it became popular to be a Christian. And so instead of 100 years ago where you would get persecuted and killed for being a Christian, now, since the emperor was a Christian and it was popular and socially acceptable to be a Christian, everyone wants to be a Christian. And you get an influx of people in the church who are not serious about their faith, who are not serious about sin, and who bring all sorts of evil wickedness into the church. In the mid-200s, the church was known for its virtue. Christians were known for giving up their lives in loving other people, for dying in the plague just to take care of the sick and the poor and the lowly. And then 100 years later, the church is just filled with people who live however they want. And ever since then, the church has struggled with reputation issues. Even in our modern day culture, is the church known primarily for good or for bad? Well, it's both, isn't it? All the scandals, all of the immorality, all of the evil committed in the name of Christ. Many other negatives that we'll get into in future classes. But for now, the church and the state has had a marriage, and the history of the world will change because of it. So after the severe persecutions there in the 200s, we have the Emperor Constantine and then the toleration of Christianity from the 300s onwards. So we're going to look at those next 1,000 years in that time. Our question for tonight is with regards to What problems does the church face when it mixes with politics? And is it worse to have the church persecuted by the state or controlled by the state? Which is the lesser of the evils? And we've got some verses to look at there. Thanks, everyone, for joining us online.